So today we have the first lecture, which is Michael Klein. He's from Vienna. He studied at the Technical University Wien, also in Paris at the Ecole Supérieure de Paris, the architecture, whatever. And then he also studied at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. Since then, since 2007, when he gained his degree, he is interested in critical research, basically in urban studies. And as far as I know, today he will talk mainly about housing in Vienna and maybe also at the other places. Let's see. And the name of the lecture is then. The name of the lecture is.
I think it's on the next slide. No?
Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Between the need and desire, the creation of the minimum. So I'm very proud to have here Michael Klein and.
Dobrý.
I can ask you to.
Yeah, I need to
help this.
Be cabled.
Great. Shall I help you with the slides or?
For a home company. You call me, I sell you goods. Like. So, dobry večer. I'm sorry that I have to switch into English. My Czech is not the best one. Thanks first, Jan, for inviting me, for having the possibility here to speak. Also having me in this lecture series, which I think is extremely interesting, about this, with the topic of contested space. And I have to say that first I intended to speak about urban marginalization and about the austerity cuts going on with kind of the neoliberal turn and with the changes in the Eurozone and throughout Europe, actually worldwide. As I think that this is a crucial point, and it's necessary that we always remind that things like access to housing has become, access to affordable housing basically, has become a major problem again. So, and together with Andreas Rumfruger, I've been working for the last couple of years. We've kind of been doing research projects and parts, I'm just mentioning parts of that. One was the SCIBE project. This is one of the publications. Then there are several derives. I don't know if someone knows. This is a journal from Vienna based on critical urbanism, let's say. So we did one about urban housing, and there's one kind of following now on the issue of scarcity and austerity coming up in next spring. And then it's also kind of then. There is also a book, or basically two books, I've written, which will be published in spring. One together with Jeremy Titul and John Goodburn and Andreas Rumfruger, which will be published in Strelka Press, and one on the housing schemes of Vienna, and then, let's say, kind of an imaginary architects collective called Blank Space, kind of trying to highlight the position between architecture and politics. But I realized somehow then that, kind of following the idea of the lecture series, I thought that probably all of the speakers will be talking about urban marginalization, about the effects of the economic crisis, the neoliberal turn within urban matters. And so there is obvious obviously there is a kind of an awareness with all of you that these things are going on. So I took that then as a let's say an impulse for myself to rather think about what is it that this thing is going on in architectural schools, that we are all kind of increasingly are involved in this critical studies, kind of the idea of what is it basically reflecting that we are doing? Are we just kind of, is it just that we are outsiders that are interested in these things? Are we speaking as activists? But what has it then to do with architecture? Is it a civic duty of the intellectual or the researcher just trying to understand what is going on? Or is there kind of an thing that is related to architecture? And how does architecture relate to that question? And I have to admit, I have no answer. I can't give any kind of a solution or something. I don't know what is to be done, let's say. But I would recommend that we should think twice before embracing all too early these kind of the architecture with good intentions, the architecture with the kind of a social intention, the political architecture. Because quite often, as we will see, or this is what I'm trying to show, this architecture of good intention is basically somehow failing, or at least not achieving what it intended to achieve. So in order to think about that, I would suggest to take a little detour in history, in kind of classical, boring architectural history. And first of all, that allows me not to show my own work. And it also allows me kind of not to offend contemporary architects. But basically what I want to say is that we somehow, what we witness is that there are some kind of classical concerns from the modernist period that somehow reappear again, such as the idea of continuous growth, or the opposite, the idea of the basic minimum, which again and again in housing, for example, is now brought up as an argument again, that people should be served with a kind of a basic minimum dwelling. So I would propose to go back into a certain moment in the European cityscape that meant a radical change for the city. That is when the city grew rapidly in the time between 1850 and 1920, 2030. And I will limit myself also with the examples to quite classical examples in the middle of Europe, let's say. And I suggest that I do an introduction on a more theoretical part with the concept of scarcity, which I think is crucial for talking about that. Trying also to understand, to show why need and desire cannot be easily separated. And I will try to discuss that in 3 examples, of classical examples. Rather from the perspective then from, let's say, contested spaces. So that these architectural examples could be considered as a form of political economy. And then we should have some time for discussion, I think. That would be interesting for me as well. So in 1849, in an essay series published at the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and which should become quite famous as Wage Labor and Capital, Karl Marx wrote, "A house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirements for residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The little house makes it clear that its inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one. And however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighboring palace rises in equal or even greater measure, the occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more uncomfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his 4 walls." So what does it basically tells us, this short little anecdote of the two houses in the hut and the palace. So first of all, that basically we are comparing and measuring our requirements. So the requirement is basically what could be assigned to the consumer side, or the demand side, within the central economic question of demand and supply. And it's this necessity, this requirement ranges from, let's say, from needs to necessities to desires. And Marx refers to it as a, here we have it, and Marx refers to it as a social requirement. So it means relative. We always compare these. And he continues and says that our desires and pleasures spring from society. So we measure them, therefore, by society and not by the object, not by the house, which serve for the satisfaction. Because they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. That's what he follows basically in his in the English translation of that Engels did in 1891. And this text was originally written in German, and it was slightly different. So what here is desires and pleasures. In the original one is Bedürfnisse and Genüsse, which would mean needs and pleasures. So we have need, desires instead of need in the translation. But I would say it's not a mistake and translational error that Engels underwent when he put it that way, when he put desire where need would have been the word. Rather, it reveals a kinship of the two, so that renders the two that maybe not the same, but at least not easily separable, so that there is kind of no clear border between needs and desire. And this kind of this relationship of need and desire should be, or will be, as we see, at the core of a socially engaged architecture, a politically permitted architecture, and particularly in its relation to scarcity, the idea of not having enough. And by scarcity, we have basically one of the fundamental reasons why space is contested, we could say. So, why there are struggles about the accessibility to space? Why are there struggles about housing? Where are all the struggles about resources? So there's always the idea that there seems too little to serve for all, that there is not enough for all, that there are some people who have kind of more rights to have these resources than others. So, and it doesn't matter if it is space or food or oil or whatever. So we can say at the core of contested space lies the concept of scarcity. So we can now try to look at the dictionary, what the reference would be. And I think it would be two words, basically, nedostatek or something like that. And the other one would be vlastnost. So one, as a certain, it also shows that scarcity does not have per se a clear meaning. So in vlastnost, I think it's a rather neutral, almost positive connotation. And we have that also in political economy. So the idea of that because there are not endlessly available things, we have to manage, we have to economize, we have to decide how to spend our 24 hours a day. So this should somehow concern us for the moment. So the scarcity of things, what people need, what they desire, and what architecture might offer there. And in architecture, needs and desires mostly represent the user, we would say. So, or today it's rather the consumer. But as the example of Marx maybe has shown already, that is also somehow a device for governing people. So a history of architecture is always also a history of needs or history of desires. And it's always the question of whose needs and whose desires are we talking about. And Marx and Engels are, of course, not the first who kind of show that there is an inseparability of need and desire. This goes way back to kind of modern Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment, like David Hume and so on, kind of that there is what I wanted to show is that there is kind of an idea within modernism, within the modern project, that somehow claims that there is no separation. There is, on the other hand, also within modernism, an idea of a positivist, as Jan and me were talking about that before, an idea of a positivist attempt to define the basic need of human beings. And if we consider scarcity as a lack, as a social problem, then it arises basically as the insufficiency of resources. So we have a relationship, a basic relationship. On the one hand, we have the resources and the availability. On the other hand, we have the needs, the wants and desires. And we have the political question, who has access to these resources. So we have a direct relationship, and both of them could be measured, let's say, in absolute terms. So we're calling this absolute scarcity. And in such an understanding, need is almost contrasted by the limited availability of material. Or in the beginning of the 20th century, we're talking about housing here. So, but insufficiency does not only arise in this absolute relationship. It has a relative component as well, as the idea of the house and the palace has shown. So it goes from the need for shelter to the desire or the need or to the person who cannot have all his desires fulfilled at one point in time. So we have to manage that. That was what I tried to explain already before. So obviously we cannot separate need and desire. Scarcity then is seemingly everywhere, ubiquitous. And also the need, our needs, seem to exceed what already is there. So there seems to be a kind of a motor for endless desire for more, for perpetual growth. And this postulate of perpetual growth is called a relative scarcity. And for this matter, it's not necessary also to determine any kind of need apart from desire. So it doesn't matter if it's about hunger or if it's something that we just want to have. Also, beyond the mere survival, and that was what I tried to show with the Marx example, there is no kind of, as I already said several times, that there is no possibility to sustain a need apart from desire. And that is also what Agnes Heller, maybe some of you know, a feminist philosopher from Hungary, worked out in her work about needs, is that in a contemporary society, we have kind of an abstract transformation of that is basically money. And money allows us to not to decide whether this is about needs or desires. On the other hand, the mechanism between money that we and you all know is one of the basic methods how scarcity as poverty is recreated the whole time. And we could say that the place for this endless desire there is a place of this endless desire and of the development of capitalism, which is basically the city. And both absolute and relative scarcity, now it's nicer images, have been a major concern with the becoming of the modern industrializing metropolis and the progressive commodification based on growth. So, if scarcity is irresolvable, we can say also that rising wealth is accompanied by more desires and more needs. So if need bears a social component, as the palace and the hut should show, so increasing affluence, increasing wealth will not solve the problem of relative scarcity. And the metropolis, we could say, is the place of production of desire, so almost a spatial epitome for this longing. So first of all, if we think about the 18th century city, it is a promise for an agricultural society moving to the city. It's a promise of labor, it's a promise of a certain freedom from serfdom, And it's also the promise that urban consumer culture gives, so a certain fluidity of status that is shown by the possession of commodities, so by the possession of things, of houses, cars, or whatever. And over the period of the 19th and 20th century, European metropolis faced enormous immigration. So taking Vienna as an example, we have in 1916 about 2.2 million inhabitants, and this is about 10 times as much as 100 years before. But as we know all, the promise of the good life in the city could not keep, so particularly not for a majority of the people. So if it comes to housing, if it comes to the living arrangements of the people, the city basically did not keep up with the growth of the population. So there was kind of always a constant shortcomings in supply. So what we can see here is basically that growth becomes enormously tied to the idea of the city. First of all, it's growth in the sense of the populational growth of the people. Then secondly, we have the rise of an absolute need for more and more housing. That is the kind of the growth of the metropolis itself. And then we have the individual economic growth in the sense of social life and its reproduction. So growth basically becomes indispensably tied to the modern metropolis. And there is probably no better example to show that exemplifies that regime of growth than the Großstadt from Otto Wagner, who some of you might know, I don't know. This is a kind of a project from 1911, and it's basically a model for infinite growth. So one of the inner rings basically is the actual situation of Vienna even today. In 1911 it was even smaller, and basically the whole project is based on an idea of endless growth of the city, of small areas. For each of them are for 150,000 inhabitants. And the main structuring force, as we see here, is basically these lines, which has infrastructure lines, that is streets and railway lines. And each of these districts is also organized basically by circulation, and the other thing by built mass, which is more or less entirely housing, or kind of the place to house all these people that come into the city. And together these form, and let's say, an economic rationality of the grid as an endless repetition of the same pattern of the block. But in fact, the whole project is mainly a text, and in this text, Wagner kind of points to the relational character of the historicity of society, almost like Marx did, we could say, but obviously from a different political standpoint. And Wagner calls also the city plan to follow the needs of the mankind of today. That's what he's basically writing. And in order to do so, he holds a rational method, an almost scientific method, an approach against any form of romanticism, a pure measuring of means, the full economization of architectural thought, we could say. So, and this scientific approach, as you can read on the left, Wien als Beispiel einer Großstadtregulierung. So Vienna is just serving as an example. This is meant to be kind of a model that can be applied to any growing city in Europe. But in fact, if we look at it, we can see that first of all, Wagner is drawing on his own plans for the development of the city that he did before, because they look quite the same, a little bit smaller, of course. It's not for 4 million people, but nevertheless. And we can also say that, I mean, this idea is, I mean, it's just crazy, basically. What he seems to establish, or wants to re-establish, is the idea of Vienna as the big center of an Habsburg Empire, which at the moment, at 1911, was already kind of over. I mean, politically not at the moment, not really, but there were nationalist movements there already. So, kind of trying to re-establish a hegemonic center, let's say, within the world. And of course, it somehow reflects the scarcity of housing in Vienna at that time. So, and the urgent need for expansion in terms of housing. But interestingly enough, Wagner is not referring to it as a lack or kind of a scarcity in a negative sense, but he tries to develop it as he phrases it in the rationale of modern economics and of relative scarcity. So growth here becomes the equivalent of development. And the need for housing results in an efficiency of repetitive multi-story residential buildings. And within this physiognomy of the buildings, he also thinks that there is the beauty of the city, and he kind of describes this beauty, lists it, and basically from the perspective of the consumer. So, and he illustrates this kind of a repetition which, with an abundance of commodities. And this abundance of commodities is the motor of growth. And to ensure this growth, Wagner basically also extends this economics as a governing device. So circulation is meant to be, coming back to this, is meant to be a major issue. I mean, it's the only thing that we can see here, basically, apart from the Danube. So we have the movement of trains and cars. First, we have the movement of the city as a growing thing, and we have also the movement of people coming to the city wide is kind of growing, and third of all, the movement of commodities in exchange. So the Großstadt is what Marx usually described as an immense accumulation of commodities here in movement, an exchange economy in a literal sense. So we can have no kind of a division, a separation from need and desire here, because any kind of fulfillment of that need would end growth. And the residential needs of the city dwellers change with the circumstances, writes Wagner. So the changing of the needs keeps alive the productivity of the faith of advancement. So the scarcity that arises here is just temporary and overcomable. And by doing so, Wagner is basically the first to translate capitalist economy into a project of the city, into an architectural formulation of the city, where we could say wealth or money is also translated into space. And if we read it as let's say, an analysis of the existing city, the Großstadt also antedates what later should be called the paradox of affluence, so that there is a need of growth because there is no other logic of coming beyond that, what contemporary economy is somehow struggling with. So with growing wealth, consumption takes what we have also seen in the example of the hut and the palace, takes up the idea to display social status, let's say a positional value. And he translates these shifts and changes in desire for the masses into residential space. So more social status means more space, basically, here. And housing cannot be anything else but a commodity. So in the endeavor for social recognition, the Großstadt's only way to show one's status is more property, a city of permanent growth. But even if the Großstadt is not facing the actual scarcity at that moment, it must be considered a utopia. It's truly realistic, let's say. And we can also extend it into the field of economy here. So in that sense, Wagner's art of urban planning, as he describes it, is a fundamental rupture within the aesthetics of architecture. So it's a breakup of an existing aesthetic regime of romanticism, of subjectivity, the architect as the designer of an object, and of representation. And he establishes a new form of an aesthetic regime. This is based on rationality and economics. So looking at it from the perspective of contested spaces, it's quite interesting that Wagner not even mentions all these personal struggles, the individual struggles of the people, the everyday struggles against housing, of having not enough food, but he somehow transforms it into a productive form. So the contested space here becomes the contest of commodities, basically the competition of the market. And in Europe, at that time, the housing question basically tightened. So the First World War brought more or less a standstill in housing production, so the crisis went even worse. And we also have to say that that up until then, architecture never really dealt with mass housing. So this was something that was left rather to an emerging discipline called sociology. It was a field of hygienics. It was also kind of an emerging field of bourgeois social reform. So there was at one point, starting with around 1850 or a little bit later, an idea within the bourgeoisie that the poverty and scarcity of housing would be a threat to the city. So, and also a threat to the bourgeois culture, let's say, a moral threat to the culture. And there's a huge development of attempts to solve the housing problem. Maybe some of you know the text by Engels, where he's called The Housing Question, where he's basically discussing all that in a very highly kind of political and very kind of polemic way. And also scarcity and poverty becomes a major issue in media. So these are newspaper photographs reflecting the housing situation in Vienna at that time. So the engagement of architecture radically changed when states and municipalities introduced large-scale housing programs. And within that shift, we also can see that the architectural discourses changes. So the architectural problem changes. We can also see that in a shift that we could see in the issue of proportion, which formerly used to be kind of an aesthetic, visual issue, and at one point it was an economic thing. So how much does it cost? How many rooms? How little? How can we minimize the area? And I think there is one way of showing that in the second theorem, the Die Wohnung für das Existenzminimum, the second congress of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne in Frankfurt in 1929, and you probably know all these buildings with Ernst May, and he basically invited a European avant-garde to discuss, as he called it, the challenge to accomplish affordable housing to the indigent class, to the working poor. So this was the invitation letter. And this was accompanied by an publication and an exhibition. And this exhibition took a radical new approach in architectural exhibitions, since the plans had been sent by all of the members of the SCIBE to Mazdam, and they were redrawn according to one scheme by Hans Leisnikov, and they were complemented by data about size, about volume and light. So this data here, the scheme was redrawn, you have sections, things like that. So we can say that not the architectural object per se, but the comparability of measuring one architecture to the other has been the goal of this exhibition and of the catalogue. So the architectural thought becomes a means of efficiency thinking here. becomes something like an economic device, let's say. And in this meeting, this went to a kind of with an architecture, with a commitment to the bottom of society, to the unproportionate class. The secretary, Siegfried Gideon, diagnosed the gap between that proper housing costs and the income of the bottom of society do not kind of fit together. And so this became the premise for any further considerations. So first was a demand that the state should support housing on one hand, but even more important here is that for the modernists basically entailed an idea that housing should look different. It should be much more efficient. So the housing for the poor should be the efficient housing. And scarcity and space should serve as supportive factors. That's what Ernst May noted. Or the apartment, much like the railway apartment, has to conform to an objective minimum that arises with purpose, which is of a biological and sociological nature. And so here we have this idea of a positivist minimum. And at one point we have kind of not any longer this idea of kind of an inseparability of need and desire. And so in order to work out that, they developed a questionnaire. And also Gropius then claimed the question of the minimum housing is one of the elementary minimum of space, of air, of light and heat one needs, so as not to be hindered in the reproduction of one's vital functions. And I think we have to, it's a little bit crazy because if we look at this, what Gropius claimed here is the notion of the minimum dwelling is nothing else but an instrument for the government for the reproduction of labor power. So what we had before, the contradiction of capitalist introduction, that is the urbanization of manpower with not enough, providing not enough housing and not good enough habitation, finds itself pacified with these schemes. So, and that's basically the optimum, then the ship's cabin. So it became somehow a remedy against poverty, but also a remedy against revolt or social insurgency. So what was contested here basically was the inhabitable space. So people in overcrowded spaces, but the fear from the bourgeoisie was basically that these people could revolt. And interestingly enough, a group of architects with very, very good intentions, basically, to help the poor, and might be worth saying that some of them were quite engaged in political movements. They took up this task of the bourgeoisie and the state, but somehow, instead of demanding more housing and bigger housing, they somehow arranged the competition of going down in size even further and further, kind of ending up with the bare minimum, the existential minimum. And even in 29, this is sometimes above the living conditions of the majority of the people. But nevertheless, the ambition here was to use the efficient way of thinking, to use economy in order to help state and the existing economic model to continue. So a biological need, as Gropius had called it. On the other hand, it allowed to create something like a minimum standard from one could go on and work out. The issues that we had before of the house and the hut, for example, of the whole modernist, the whole modern movement of Hume and all these people, is here almost rejected or kind of reversed. It is kind of turned upside down into something which is kind of a crude minimum that almost suppresses people, or what we today would maybe call austerity. But the housing question did not only engage architects, planners, and social reformers. It also engaged people themselves. So So some years after the Großstadt of Wagner, in Vienna the housing crisis reached a peak during the war, with thousands of people homeless. The people took the matters into their own hands, and unable to pay their skyrocketing rents, people started to squat land on the outskirts of the city, dump sites, for example, and they just kind of built up their own sheds and makeshift shacks in order to to have some land for growing vegetables and to make it enough food for survival, let's say. Also because of a huge lack of heating materials, so you can see the forest encircling around Vienna above first and after the turning it down. So this third example is rather unlike the theoretical considerations within architecture, has to be regarded as a praxis of self-help, of empowerment, even if later it was supported by the municipality of Red Vienna or by architects. And unlike other European cities, Vienna didn't have this kind of a huge garden city tradition. So for these people, this was quite fruitful because they had the possibility to build up their own structures. And within a few months, basically, the individual struggle for survival, which you can see still on the left in these makeshift shacks, transformed into something which was built up in cooperatives, in building guilds, in a kind of a movement with its own organization. So non-profit construction and material enterprises, which were in close relationship to the trade unions then. And this self-organization did not only allow for the self-supply with edibles and growing vegetables, it also allowed to raise a common voice. So here you have one of the papers, which is the Siedler, the settler, and the announcement for one of the big demonstrations at the bottom of the page. And this is a picture of that demonstration where thousands of people, of the settlers, went to the city hall, expressing their ultimate needs. So get us land, wood and bricks, and we will turn it into bread, was their slogan. And this mutual aid fostered the idea of a common future. So this cooperative organization went beyond what we usually call the economies of scale. So it's not just people gathering in order to buy more for a cheaper price, but it became truly a social-political project on an organizational as well as on a physical level. So first, the organizational level, as you can see maybe here, this was the consolidation of production, the material provision and distribution, instead of on a cooperative basis instead of a competitive basis of the market. So an organization in guilds, and a quite elaborate system of combining professional labor and unskilled labors. As you can see, these women, for example, contributing also to their own building up of their own housing schemes. And doing so aimed for a certain resilience from the private sector, from the market. And maybe some of you know Otto Neurath from this isotype pictorial statistics, or maybe from the Vienna Circle, because he was a philosopher too, and he was also an economist, and he became secretary of this settlement movement. And probably like no other, he shaped that organizational structure, and this one is by him, basically. So, and then later, the other thing, the physical form of that, you can also see in a change in the way how people build them. So there were attempts to build up common venues, so-called Schutzhäuser, and you can also see it here in the urban form of the whole pattern. So by and by, they got support by architects, and by the municipality. Architects, for example, like Adolf Loos or Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, who was the first women's architect in Austria, also Franz Schuster and some others. And Mörder describes, and I think one can see it here, the settlers counter any form of isolation, any right of disposal over land and buildings so as to protect solidarity, the totality of houses, and not the single house as object of design. The single house is the brick in a building. So also here there is kind of an idea of an architectural minimum and of efficiency thinking, even below the standard of Frankfurt. But there are some major differences, and I think there's one example that could be worth looking at it. And this is a series of so-called Kernhäuser, core houses. And it's about 20 prototypes they developed, and yeah, not all of them were built, but kind of some they were built kind of quite a lot, and they were developed basically by Schütte-Lihotzky, by Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, by George Carr, Franz Schuster, Franz Schachel, and some others, and they were meant to be built at minimum costs. But unlike in Frankfurt, the Kernhaus did not seek an end in the basic minimum, but here it's the starting point. So here you can see first the ground floor, which was the first part, then the extension to the roof, then the extension to the left, and then the extension on top. So even if they are organized on the basis of an ultimate basic need, this need was quite the opposite of an ahistorical kind of positivist minimum need. So the conception of need as well as the conception of scarcity here becomes temporary and overcomable in time. So even if the core house is not the only form that was applied here, and they are not fully representative for the whole thing, I think that the idea of a non-determined future and then kind of a developable need here is kind of laid out in the spatial configurations that is characteristics for the settlements. Here there are several further drawings by Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky on the core house. So gradually, then after, the movement somehow institutionalized. And this was necessary, as I mentioned before, in order to get money, because in fact, people did not own anything, so they were relying on the support by the municipality of Red Vienna, also in terms of financing and land policy. It's mitigated, on the other hand, also the oppositional tones towards the municipality, and ultimately brought an end to the settlement movement when Red Vienna turned towards more dense mass housing. Some of you probably know that these kind of housing schemes of the 20s and 30s. So there were several reasons for that, and one of them was also kind of a battle between proponents of the settlement against the housing block. This was also a kind of huge debate going on in Frankfurt. It's also a shift in the question, how should the worker live within politics. It basically is a shift also from a cooperative guild socialism towards a municipal socialism, which came then after. And this remained in a way quite difficult. And I mean, basically we shouldn't romanticize too much the whole thing, because after a few years the whole thing turned into, let's say, a kind of a petty bourgeois smugness in nice little houses, kind of. And finally, when the Nazis took over and turned it over, the whole cooperative idea was gone. So like the proponents of the avant-garde in Frankfurt, we also have the settlement cooperatives endorsed in standardization or minimum floor plans and things like that. And we cannot hide the strong parallel between the two. If we have again Neurath. So the sameness of housing, the sameness of components, is the expression of austerity and of a sense of equality, at the same time rooted in brotherhood and in envy. So we have strong parallels between Frankfurt and Vienna. Also personal consistencies, like Margarete Schüttli-Hotzky went then to Frankfurt, or Franz Schuster, and several others as well. And still there are some fundamental differences. In Frankfurt, the state was basically the central power, and in Vienna it's rather the cooperative that laid ground for that. The avant-garde idea in Frankfurt of the minimization here is rather opposed to an idea of a maximization, let's say, because the cooperative movement started from almost nothing. And architecturally, I think we can see that quite well, that the settlement movement did not want to settle with the minimum. It tried to use that minimum as a starting point, but never to end up there. Also, the economic basis was quite different. So Frankfurt operated within the market economy and regulated by the state, and the SCIBE basically did not digress from that approach. Also in Vienna, this stayed within a kind of market economy, but it was their attempt to build up a new economic structure from within. So based on barter, on the exchange of, not of commodities, but of material. And this is more or less based in Otto Neurath's vision of an administrated, kind of a central administrative socialism. And this Naturalwirtschaft, as he calls it, maybe an economy in kind, almost leaves money behind and returns to a direct exchange of goods. So need, we could say, is here brought to a physical status, but it's changeable over time, so it's not meant to kind of end with that one need. This exchange of construction material in terms of economy, the barter economy, the exchange of construction material and of knowledge still holds a notion of scarcities, but these scarcities are always temporary and overcomable. And the need for scarcity, as it was for Wagner, for example, this model almost has kind of just abandoned. On the other hand, I mean, this commonality of the housing schemes, this last one, the orchestra, the commonality and also this idea of the Naturalwirtschaft are characterized with a certain idiosyncrasy with the whole modernist movement. So if we compare it to Wagner, so that the Gemeinschaft of these settlements almost resembles to a step back to recreate an ordered world that didn't exist any longer with the metropolis. For Wagner, for example, this would have been just kind of a romantically reactionary world, and also for the modern economic movement. For Neurath, however, this was the settlement movement was the model for a second to next future. So what I basically tried to show here is several things. So that we, first of all, I think, and this is why I took these quite classical examples from architecture, and maybe the last one not that much classical, but nevertheless, I think that this idea of contested space is very much based in our everyday life. It's not something that exists outside of architecture, that this exists within architecture. So any kind of space here is in a way contested. So the second thing I wanted to show basically is that the intention of architects to do good needs to be reflected at any point quite critically. So quite often we want to achieve the opposite, what basically is the output of it. So similar cases of the minimum dwelling, or what I try to discuss with the minimum dwelling, because I don't want to abandon the concept at all, we can find in contemporary examples of alternative use of kind of temporary uses, for example, of the idea of participatory approaches. And quite often these effects are basically just trying to expand or maximize the profitability of architecture. And the third thing that I wanted to show is basically that there is any kind of architecture has an accompanying form of political economy. So for these architectural economies, it's necessary to state that they don't exist outside of architecture, but they are kind of somehow really tied to the architecture. They're part of it. So form is not something that exists apart from that, but it's kind of directly involved, inseparably involved. So if we have the three examples, then the Großstadt of Otto Wagner portrayed housing as a true commodity embedded in an environment of growth, and trying to represent the model where housing becomes, or space becomes a positional good so as to indicate social status. And it's based basically on relative scarcity. And against this conception we have the Congress of the Wohnung für das Existenzminimum, which tried to work out or discuss strategies for the production of affordable space for the bottom of society, for the poor. This somehow always was relying on a biological need, on a positivist, on a measurable need, and tried to kind of separate the need from further desire. On the other hand, I mean, it's opened up for having at least a minimum that we can rely on. Also, the praxis of these settlers has its form of scarcity, of needs and wants and desires. And here they have to be considered as historical, to change over time. They have a minimum standard, but this minimum standard is just a starting point. And there are kind of new needs also that emerge out of here. New needs in terms of a kind of new need for cohabitation, of mutual help, for example. So here housing, as opposed to Wagner, holds almost no positional value. Here it is a right. So not so much as a quantifiable right as in the Siam, but here is a kind of a true right for housing. To claim a right for housing as one's basic human right. So that was it, what I wanted to say. Thank you.